Thanks for coming out tonight. I've been really looking forward to this talk for a while now. I personally have been, looking at Bitcoin broadly speaking for like a few years in an in-depth way now. And about 6 months ago, I started learning a lot more about the less prominent implementations, Bitcoin Cash and Bitcoin SV. So I thought, and there's not a ton of dialogue between the communities, just in trying to find speakers for tonight. It was a little bit political, and it I had a lot of people write from each of the kind of people that were into all the different implementations write me, I'm not comfortable doing this talk because the people from the other sides or the other chains are not going to be able to have a conversation. So just the fact that we're all here tonight means a lot, and I'm really looking forward to having a good, productive dialogue free of memes and politics.
Good luck with it.
Yes. So, as opposed to botching the intros, I'm going to let each speaker kind of introduce themselves and what made them interested in Bitcoin originally. Let's try to keep it to like 1 or 2 minutes a person. Sonu.
Sure. I first heard about Bitcoin in 2012. 2013 is when I really started using Bitcoin, and it was obviously during the bull run at that time. And then I taught my first class in 2014, and in 2017 I taught over 200 hours of Ethereum, which will probably be surprising for some people. I've taught over 200 hours of all blockchains, Quorum, Hyperledger, new Partleaf, Hashgraph, and all these keep popping out. But basically, I've spoken on every topic that has been there. So when Bitcoin Cash forked off, at first I was part of the BTC camp and just said, oh, Roger Ver, this and that. And I was like, Roger Ver, he did good for the community. I remember he did good for the community. And so then I started really realizing there's another subreddit, and I started getting some more information there. Then you can sort of say my eyes opened up, and then there's more to that. But
Cool, thank you, Sonu. And Jonathan?
Hi, Jonathan Toomim. So I heard about Bitcoin during the great slash dotting of 2012. Didn't get into it for a while though. Started to mine actually with my brother because I learned my brother lived in Seattle, which had cheap hydroelectric power. So I thought, hey, this might be a fun hobby. Started doing that in like 2014. That hobby got out of control. Eventually I had a 2 megawatt data center in Washington, which I now run for currency mining. In 2015, I started getting involved in development because I saw like the release of Bitcoin XT, and I thought, hey, this is a good idea. We should fix this block size problem thing because it's going to be a huge problem soon. So I contributed some code then. Later in like January 2016, I helped co-found the Bitcoin Classic project, which was supposed to be a compromise to do a hard fork to 2 megabytes, which I thought everybody could agree on. Everybody didn't agree, surprise. But yeah, so after that, there's like you mentioned, there's a lot of politics. There was a lot of bad blood directed towards me, so I kind of ducked out of public life for a while after that. But shortly after Bitcoin Cash was forked, I started to gain a little bit more interest and started to pick up development on that. So I've recently become a developer for Bitcoin ABC and Bitcoin Unlimited, and I'm working on some block propagation stuff using a technology that I call Xthinner, because it's like Xthin except more or less. Also, R in Chinese means 2, so it's Xthin 2. Anyway.
Thank you, Jonathan.
My name is Chandra. I first heard about Bitcoin in 2011. I mined a little bit, lost some with Mt. Gox and some with throwing away my hardware. Came back into crypto towards the end of 2016 when Ethereum was getting some traction, mind space, smart contracts were interesting. Currently, I'm working on fixing the usability problem, not just specifically on Bitcoin, but for secure storage of all kinds of different coins and exchange without exchange risk, but preserving the speed and liquidity of what centralized exchanges can provide. Because without tradability, you are not going to see the rapid adoption that we've seen so far. You compared crypto, Bitcoin, or crypto space in general, if you think of it as an asset class, the reason for super fast adoption and the rate at which this space progresses faster than any of the other technological trends like AI, AR, VR, etc. One of the main reasons is the liquidity and tradability that is inherent in token space on blockchains. So I'm working on a company doing that. Today, I guess I'm here to talk about Bitcoin and.
Yeah, thank you, Chandra. This is for everyone, but Chandra, you went last first, so you can start this one. And in like a minute or less, how would you describe the major difference between Bitcoin BTC and Bitcoin SV and Bitcoin Cash?
So I'll take up first part of the question, which is how do you describe the difference between BTC and Bitcoin Cash? BTC is a specific chain. Bitcoin, depending on who you ask, there's a lot of debate on this. It's a set of principles, it's a set of concepts, etc. But broadly speaking, Bitcoin chain is trying to be, let's talk about the intent or the stated value proposition that it's going after, which is digital gold, store of value. Not so concerned about the medium of exchange function, supporting, transaction scalability, transaction throughput. Bitcoin Cash came out of the SegWit 2x disagreement and the New York agreement, which failed. The contentious issue between those two is the fundamental disagreement on what value proposition you're trying to solve first. Are you trying to be the ledger with the highest level of ledger assurance or security, or are you trying to be scalable enough to get utility from day one? That is what characterizes it in my mind. Of course, there are technical differences, but that's essentially the broad strokes.
Thank you.
Yeah, so I'd characterize the spectrum from Bitcoin SV to BTC as being one of the trade-off between centralization risk and scalability. And BTC says that we should never compromise decentralization of the currency for scaling, at least not for on-chain scaling. You can do off-chain things like Lightning, but never on-chain stuff, because that would make blockchain bloated, and then people can't run their own full nodes. BSV says this centralization stuff is overblown. You can scale as much as you want if you just put some nodes in high-powered data centers, and that's good enough. BCH, Bitcoin Cash, believes that there's a middle road, that you can have high scalability, not super ridiculously awesome terabyte scale scalability, but pretty high, using just regular desktop machines and home computers with home internet connections. And there's a path to do that. That's what Bitcoin Cash is trying to do. It's trying to pave that middle road. Also, there's the question of hard forks. Bitcoin Cash thinks that hard forks are fine. Bitcoin SV and BTC both are kind of afraid of them.
So in every sense, we've kind of at the middle of the road here, Jonathan.
Well, except for the hard fork thing.
Yes.
I think it's easy to understand what Bitcoin Cash and Bitcoin SV have our differences with BTC. There's a bigger thing there. But to differentiate from BCH, we're focused on building technologies, new technologies, and increasing the transactions by building new technologies. And you need to increase the block size as fast as possible, because we're going to have our halving sometime soon anyway. So the main thing about, the also bigger thing about BSV is that we don't want to change the protocol at all. The protocol does not need to be changed. It goes simple to TCP/IP. If we had multiple implementations of TCP/IP, the internet would not be as good as it is now. So by keeping, I'm sorry.
Yeah. And the interruptions are just to make sure that we can cover all the different things. I'm sure we could all talk here for 3 or 4 hours, but I'm not sure everyone else wants to necessarily listen to that. So kind of in line with that, what is the biggest misunderstanding about the asset that you feel like you're an expert on? Just generally in the community, not necessarily from people that are representing other chains, but just in general, what's the biggest misunderstanding of Bitcoin Cash or Bitcoin?
I'll take it up about Bitcoin. The biggest misunderstanding is that it doesn't scale and that it's necessarily a bad thing from day one. The other problem that a lot of people have is about the value proposition, right? It doesn't have utility. Everybody says that it doesn't have utility. But utility is entirely subjective, and people are using it to speculate, and it has the highest transaction throughput of any other public blockchain. So that's the biggest misconception. I think that's wrong. Anybody who holds Bitcoin is actually deriving utility from holding it for whatever reason, whether they're speculating, whether they're expecting it to be a store of value, whether they're expecting it to be a medium of exchange one day, it doesn't matter. People are holding it, and that's utility.
I think I already touched on this. I think it's the proposition that if you scale on-chain, you're going to be centralized. And we've done the math, we've done simulations, we've built machines that can handle gigabyte blocks for about $400. It's definitely possible. There are some speed bumps along the way. It's not like totally trivial, but it's also not particularly hard. So,
I think a major miscommunication that's happening with Bitcoin SV, where I think a big misunderstanding is the fact that they want to call BSV centralized in a certain aspect because N-Chain is doing a lot of the work. But the misunderstanding here is that when you have developers constantly changing the protocol, that is actually centralization. I think a lot of times people flip it around, and so I think the best way to understand about Bitcoin SV is that it is a stable protocol that people can believe and trust and know that will never be changed.
So you're saying, what would specifically be the biggest misunderstanding about SV? Is that it's centralized, but people say it's centralized, but it's not centralized? Is that what you're saying?
I'd probably say that. I think people just are not researching enough. I think when you do enough research, there really isn't too much to misunderstand. I don't know if I'm saying that clear enough. I mean, I probably will hear what some of the misunderstandings are as we go through.
Okay. So in my research and kind of looking at the differences, it seems like there's different types of centralization with different types of trade-offs. And it seems like, everyone on the panel here probably has a different interpretation of what types of centralization to be worried about are. I know, Jonathan, if you want to take this one first, because you've kind of been, in the middle of the roads and looking at the different aspects of centralization, how would you define the different types of centralization to be concerned about or that are present?
Okay, so Satoshi's main concern for centralization was for miner centralization. As long as the incentives to mine were fair enough to everybody, including small miners, that would indicate, or that would encourage there to be a broad base of mining hash rate, which meant that censorship of transactions would be very difficult, and that doing attacks like double spends would be very difficult. So that's what Satoshi had in his white paper. And people have often focused on that, and that is very important. It's important to make sure that no one entity, no one person gets anywhere close to having 51% of the hash rate. Even 30% is too much. So that's A. But another big one is control of the development or control of the system in other ways. And one of the things that seems to have happened on Bitcoin Core is that there is a group of about 5 to 10 people, about 70% of whom work for Blockstream, who have effectively gotten control over what does and does not happen in that protocol. And back in 2014, 2015, it seemed like a majority of the users of Bitcoin wanted an increase in block size, but the majority of the developers of that small group did not. And guess who won? So we call that developer centralization, and Bitcoin Cash now has 6 different full node implementations from completely different teams because we got burned with that particular problem, and now we have something else going on.
So real quick, we've touched upon miner centralization, developer centralization. Is there another type of centralization?
Full node centralization.
Full node centralization.
I guess also concentration of wealth.
Okay. So specifically, are there any other types of centralization to be worried about? And after that, I'm sure you have a different point of view of which of these different types of centralization to be more worried about.
I'm going to answer your question right after I make this statement, which is if you don't care about centralization and if you wanted to do peer-to-peer cash, we already have it. It's in your wallet. You can trade with anybody peer-to-peer without an intermediary. Settlement is a different issue. I agree with him about different dimensions of centralization. A lot has been written about it. There's contentious arguments. You can talk about mining centralization. I'm not going to refer to what Satoshi was afraid of because ASICs were predicted way before Bitcoin for any specific kind of mining. That necessarily doesn't deter me, and it's not a big problem. The path to decentralization in mining is when you approach the limit of physics, when commodity hardware becomes widely available. That is the path to decentralization, and then the amount of hash rate concentration is going to be dependent on energy markets locally and how conducive the local jurisdictions are for mining. That's the path to ultimate decentralization. It runs through commoditization of hardware. Just like you see in personal computers, CPUs, GPUs, etc. The second aspect of it is how many dimensions of decentralization there are. Everything is arbitrary. You can measure hash rate concentration, it doesn't matter. You can measure reference clients, you can measure all sorts of different dimensions. At the end of the day, it's going to be subjective how you weight each one of those dimensions.
How do you weight it?
I look at, so let's take one thing that he talked about, which is node centralization. The only thing that actually matters to me, the only node that matters is my full node. I don't care how many other full nodes are running, because as long as you can fully verify the transactions, you know the truth. That's all you care about. Mining centralization, yes, there are economic arguments to be made about, yes, Chinese miners are concentrated in one mining pool or in one geographic area, one jurisdiction. The counterpoint to that is they actually build up the cost of attack for cost of a 51% attack. And that's one aspect of centralization that is overblown, overhyped, overdiscussed. Developer centralization is definitely an issue, but again, quality of code commits, number of people who are doing the code commits, it doesn't matter. It is entirely going to be evaluated subjectively. There is no objective dimension to quantify this. So, I take the side that I want. Gini coefficient is completely arbitrary. It doesn't matter. Concentration of wealth again doesn't matter. You just go by. At the end of your argument, you are making a subjective argument in every dimension of centralization.
Sure, but specifically, you're talking about the Gini coefficient not really mattering. Do you want to expand upon why the concentration of wealth isn't a concern?
It's how you get to that concentration or dilution that matters. There's nothing that says concentration per se is a problem. That is a political argument. That's not an economic argument. So it doesn't matter. If you're measuring Gini coefficient to kind of give you how, if you identified dimensions of centralization, if you said, hey, we all agree that mining centralization in the hands of these many people is bad, then Gini coefficient is going to help you. But it's not going to tell you whether or not you should make that argument. Same thing with developer centralization, reference clients, number of people in different jurisdictions that are committing the code, taking Pura on Ethereum, You could say one instance of AWS, all of these nodes are running in 17 different geopolitical jurisdictions. Is that centralized or decentralized? It's highly subjective. Gini coefficient is not going to help you there.
So do you want to speak to mining centralization?
Yeah, so I'll speak to both senses of centralization. First of all, there's no developer centralization in BSV because we're not changing the protocol anymore. Everything gets built on top of Bitcoin, right? So it's building the wallets, it's building the real businesses. So this is why BSV is separate from all of them. There's no protocol changes being made in BSV. This gives governments and businesses confidence to build on top of Bitcoin, knowing that the protocol will never change. In terms of mining centralization, Bitcoin doesn't care about small miners. This is about who can build the best hardware to mine Bitcoins as fast as possible. The whole concept of a full node is useless. There's no need to have a full node. Okay, that is a waste to the entire system. It's just a form of and so in terms of mining centralization, it's whoever has the best hardware. It's a competitive system. That is what Bitcoin has always meant to be. And small miners will get taken out. If you worry about big miners, look what happened to Bitmain. It will always be competition. We'll take out whoever it needs to be, and you'll have new people taking up.
So to be clear, if I don't know what the exact numbers are, but let's say Bitcoin SV, you had a single miner that had 35% of the hash power.
About 65%.
65%. So is that a concern? And if not, could you expand a little bit more on why?
I think that even from Bitcoin Cash's camp, they would also understand this aspect of, first of all, there isn't one person controlling 65%. As time has passed by, it's gotten more decentralized. You have new miners joining the pool. K-Pool just joined it. They got 20% of the hash rate from BSV. Nobody knows who they are. They're just a random group of miners that just showed up. So then you have to go back to why wouldn't they collude and try to destroy the system? That goes back into why would they spend so much money into destroying their own system? It makes no sense. Why would you be mining Bitcoin only for you to destroy the own system that you're trying to profit from?
So to be clear, the argument is that because it's going to be against the economic interests of miners, even let's say with a majority hash power, there's not a concern around collusion because it's against their, how you see their economic interests.
And also think about it. Imagine if how would they even collude together to all of a sudden change which transaction? So, I mean, it's not even just that. It's, imagine now if they did try to go and collude, it'd have to be this billion-dollar transaction, $1 trillion transaction. It doesn't make sense to do it for smaller transactions. And then they'd all have to time it together and the transaction would have to go through them. So I'm not gonna rule it out, but I'm trying to say that there's just a lot of steps and it's much more easy to take over our current financial system than Bitcoin.
Do you mind if I add a little point?
Sure.
Yeah. I would also like to say something else.
Okay.
Right. So adding to what he said, there's a security guarantee. What is the capex that people have to essentially write off if they do an attack because they've already? So that's one level of assurance, right? Ledger assurance. There's a valid argument to be made. We can make it stronger by increasing either the capex or the opex of performing these attacks. But necessarily, mining centralization is not a problem. It all comes down to incentive engineering.
So I listed the types of centralization earlier, but I forgot to make a distinction. There's a big distinction to be made between pool centralization and mining decentralization. The ability to censor transactions and to do double spends comes from pool decentralization, not from the ownership of the hardware. The ownership of the hardware is usually pretty broadly distributed. Most miners have maybe 10 megawatts or so in their data center. That's like 0.1% of the total SHA-256 hash rate. But the variance in block rewards strongly encourages people to band together to mitigate risk. And that produces the mining pools that are 5, 15, 30% of the network hash rate. That's one of the effects. There are also other effects. As far as the risks of having one person or one company at the helm with a large amount of hash rate, something that people often forget is that what happens if Antigua decides to abduct Calvin Ayre and hold him hostage until he tells his workers to implement a certain policy with their full nodes. Calvin Ayre currently controls both CoinGeek and SV Pool, which, as of today, over the last week, has had 51% of the hash rate. That's coincidental. It was actually 65% a few days ago. So it doesn't necessarily have to be that he wants to do this. It's just a single point of failure. And it's much better to avoid that.
How do you feel like that can be avoided?
So a lot of miners fled from SV because they didn't like Calvin Ayre and especially CSW. So yeah, don't follow unpopular people. That's one big thing.
I think let's move on to a different topic right now. So, Chandra, in your view, what led to the split of Bitcoin to, Bitcoin Core and Bitcoin Cash, BTC, BCH?
It was this debate over utility and the block size. SegWit was okay. It fixed transaction malleability, it added block space, technically. Bitcoin Cash wanted a 2 MB block size, and the miners that supported the New York agreement didn't like the fact that it didn't go through, so they just said, to hell with it, we're gonna hard fork. But I wasn't in that room, and I wasn't part of those discussions. That's as far as I know.
Oh, one other thing.
It is the fundamental disagreement about utility. Roger, if you consider him the figurehead for BCH, is of the opinion, or at least his co-reliever is of the opinion, that without being a medium of exchange, without being an actual usable peer-to-peer cash system today, Bitcoin will not have a future. And Bitcoin Core or Bitcoin as it exists today, they disagree with that. So it's a fundamental disagreement on how to get to eventual global adoption.
That sounds like I imagine something that we can all agree on. That description of the fork was
Pretty close.
pretty close, Sonu?
One important factor is when SegWit, one of the reasons they wanted to create SegWit was because of transaction malleability.
What's SegWit?
SegWit was the change in protocol that BTC did, which is what the reason why Bitcoin Cash even forked off from the first place from BTC is because they were going to remove transaction malleability and essentially just change the protocol. This is why Bitcoin Cash forked. So the biggest one of the reasons why Bitcoin Cash had forked away from BTC at that time, they wanted to create SegWit because of transaction malleability, which is the transaction can change. So what you're going to start seeing some developments on Bitcoin SV is you're going to see us starting to use transaction malleability. That it was originally intentionally supposed to be a part of Bitcoin. And so you'll see that as time passes.
So it seems like there's roughly like a point of agreement here on kind of generally what the different implementations are trying to accomplish, and let me know if this is an accurate, description, which is, Bitcoin Core BTC is going after like digital gold and smaller block sizes. Bitcoin SV and Bitcoin Cash are both going after bigger block sizes, with the key difference where Bitcoin SV doesn't want to change the protocol and wants more innovation on the hardware level, and then Bitcoin Cash wants more innovation on the protocol level and is okay changing the protocol.
Also, Bitcoin SV doesn't want anonymity in the coin. We want governments and businesses to build on top of Bitcoin, and if there's anonymity, it's actually going to cause more regulation from the government to try to crack down on it.
So I think that one of the defining moments for the split can be traced back to December 2015 when Gregory Maxwell published his roadmap for Bitcoin. And that roadmap included SegWit, but the SegWit was just a step towards what he saw as the holy grail or so of scaling, which was the Lightning Network. The purpose for SegWit's reduction or elimination of transaction malleability was to fix a specific bug that made it much harder for the Lightning Network to work. And this seemed like a really good idea because Lightning Network would allow for an infinite number of transactions per second between parties through the magic of payment channels. And it sounded really good on paper. But the people who ended up becoming Bitcoin Cash looked at the Lightning Network's design and thought, this is really cool tech, this is awesome stuff. But there are so many corner cases. There are a lot of strange ways in which somebody using the Lightning Network can lose their money through no fault of their own. If fees get too high, then their payment channel can't close, and they can have their money stolen from them. If their hard drive crashes and they don't have a backup from that day, they can lose money in their payment channel, and they have to have their node online 24/7 in order to receive payments. You can't just go to sleep and have the power go out or have your server crash and still be able to receive payments. And this provides significant usability problems that makes the the Lightning Network unviable as a solution for scaling, in our view.
So yeah, more specifically, when I say Bitcoin Core is a bigger fan of smaller block sizes, and Cash and SV of bigger block sizes, more specifically that means Bitcoin Core is for off-chain scaling for medium of exchange and payments, and SV and Cash are for on-chain scaling of that. So I think this is a really good transition to talk about the Lightning Network, because I think a lot of at least to my understanding, the argument for why Bitcoin could be, potentially the world's global currency, is incumbent on the Lightning Network or things like it, where you can have a payment network on top. So I'll let you speak to the Lightning Network.
I'll say fixing transaction malleability doesn't just allow Lightning, it allows other layer 2 protocols to be implemented. If Lightning Network fails or doesn't work, that's okay. You can have a lot more other implementations, like for example for centralized exchanges. It's a specific function utility-based design of layer 2. Lightning Network has sucked the air out of the room. It's great tech. It has some problems. but that is not the end all be all of it. Fixing transaction malleability allows you to do many other layer 2 solutions. So that's a good thing. The question about, do you have to scale layer 1 or can you leave scaling to layer 2? I'm actually on the side of leaving scaling to layer 2 and layer 3 solutions. And that's just the way it works in the real world. Nobody's actually buying coffee with their gold coin. They're not going to tear a tiny piece of a gold foil. That's just fine. It is the settlement layer. And you also don't want the risk from the collapse of a layer 2 or layer 3 solution to impact the base chain. For example, if Visa or MasterCard fails, it is not going to impact the Forex markets. And that's the way it should be. The risk should be decapitated at layer 1.
Okay, so in talking about payments and store value, what properties, Sonu, do you think are helpful in making an asset a good store of value?
Okay, before I answer that, just real quick, first of all, transactionability is not a fix. It's actually a feature of Bitcoin. And also, I'm a business, and I have a print and ship store, and I sell bumper stickers for $4, and I ship it all over the world. So, okay, so
Let's stick with the questions, yeah. So, store of value.
So store of value is not something doesn't become a store of value first. You use something and then it becomes a store of value. Gold was used before it became a store of value. It wasn't just a store of value. It was used as tools, it was used as jewelry. It's now being used as electricity or to conduct electricity. And then it becomes a store of value.
So my question is, what properties do you think are helpful for making something a store of value? Are you saying just usability or are there other things?
I'd assume that if something is more useful, that it encompasses a lot of other features. So being able to, I mean, you can say, okay, it's got to be fast, cheap, and reliable. It's got to be, fungible, whatever the properties of money are. I mean, I'm already making those assumptions, but it's got to be.
Well, don't just make them. What do you think the helpful properties of a store of value are?
Okay, sure. I mean, well, gold has been a store of value, but it's not easy to transport. So it's still a store of value. So I don't think it needs to be moving so fast, but that is something that Bitcoin does have. It's just got to be something understood by everybody. It's got to be, we would like, and Bitcoin, and Bitcoin is supposed to be a faster way to send money, and easy to use, and yeah, I mean, it should just be something that you don't really think about. It should just be there. I can't really give a better example.
Okay, do you have any?
Sure.
Yeah.
So in game theory, there's this concept called a game called a Keynesian beauty contest. And so the Keynesian beauty contest is a game where each person guesses who everybody else is going to nominate as the most beautiful person in the room. And so this has some really strange properties. People are always trying to second guess themselves, and then they're trying to third guess everybody else, and fourth guess, and so forth. It's an inherently recursive process. And what makes a good store of value is something that other people believe is going to be a good store of value. It's a Keynesian beauty contest. So how do you start seeding people to believe that it's going to be a good store of value? Well, you can do something with the markets, like in, the Netherlands in the 15th century. You could start telling people how tulips are going to be the next great thing. And that can do a lot. That can make people really excited about it. And then they see the price go up and they say, oh yes, this is going to be the store of value for the world. And everybody buys tulips until they start to rot and the market crashes. So these kinds of Keynesian beauty contests are inherently unstable. And if we have something that is, the basic elements of something that can be a store of value are scarcity, fungibility, it has to be like all parts have to be equivalent, divisibility, transportability, and durability. Those are the main things. Usefulness is also a strong contributor. So having something that is useful and that people are going to want, even if the markets are saying that it's going down or going up, that will add a lot of stability to the price, to the exchange rate of that thing. And I think that that's something that we should try to encourage. But mostly, the answer to what will make Bitcoin or Bitcoin Cash a store of value, my answer is that I don't care. I don't want Bitcoin to be a store of value. I want it to be value itself. I want it to help people. And if Bitcoin makes people rich and it makes other people poor, that's not valuable. What we need is for something that helps people in a way that a fiat currency doesn't. And an example of this, Venezuela. So many people in Venezuela are super, super skinny because the money that they made last month is now worth 1/100th or 1/10 of what it was last month.
A lot less.
Yeah, they can't buy food, they can't save, they can't order anything from abroad. They're completely beholden to their government, and the government just inflates the currency to pay off its debts. And that is exactly the problem that Bitcoin could have solved, but it didn't because it didn't scale.
So I agree with half of what he said.
Which half?
The half about the properties of good money, right? Fungibility, portability, scarcity, holding its value over time. That's, I guess, a recursive argument. You're talking about store value. All of those things are true, but I don't agree with utility. If that were the case, iron would be the store of value and the settlement layer, or steel, and it isn't. It inherently has a lot more.
Not scarce.
Yes, it is not scarce. So utility is kind of low down on the list. The other issue is how did gold get to be? Nobody knows exactly. You can talk about, shells being used. You can look at history. You can look at economic arguments, the regression theorem. Those are all backward-looking theorems. Nothing says that that's the only way new money will come to get adopted, because there's a discontinuity, which is the existence of money prices. As long as you have existence of money prices in whatever currency it is that you have today, anything that becomes store of value, but we know that it has to have these properties to be a good store of value over the long term. If arbitrarily I can print whatever the hell I want, then it's not going to hold its value over time. You don't need, great economic analysis to know this. And because store of value function is different from utility, and Bitcoin, because it is trying to be a store of value first, it is a digital collectible as of now, it is not money yet. Hopefully it'll be the settlement layer or the store of value, and then it'll become the medium of exchange, and whatever steps we need to take to make it scale will be done then. I mean, we don't need to prefix the problem that doesn't exist today. No one is trying to buy coffee with their Bitcoin. It doesn't even make any economic sense. With an asset that fluctuates 15, 20, 30% per day, you'd be irrational to spend that because you cannot calculate your profits and losses. It is not a stable coin with any of the other highly liquid currencies that you have in your pocket. It makes no sense to spend it. It is being used for periodic transfers of value, which is the way it should be. And I store it because I'm speculating that it'll be store of value and medium of exchange in the future. It is entirely speculative. Any currency other than a stable coin is entirely speculative at this point. So we don't need to fix the transaction through problem.
Just yet.
Okay, moving on here. How do you all feel about the likelihood of more than one of the Bitcoin chains gaining mass adoption? Perhaps a future where there is a, let's say, store of value BTC, and then a more medium of exchange or infrastructure layer BCH or BSV?
I can really only see, I personally believe it will be just BSV. I can see BCH living for a while, and the main reason is because it's just a one or none thing. So it's the same thing when it comes back to the internet, TCP/IP, right? If we had multiple implementations of TCP/IP, internet would not be where it is right now. We need one protocol to build on.
So what I'm asking is, yes, for one protocol in terms of building on, I understand that it might be one or none, but what about, as Chandra just said, BTC is not trying to be like the TCP/IP of value. It's trying to be like digital gold. Do you see a world in which there can be, let's say, like a BSV that's like the TCP/IP of value and a like store of value in BTC? Do you see a world where both of those exist?
I can't see that. I can only see BCH surviving only because it's got anonymity, and there's going to be people who want the anonymity, but I think then regulation will catch up to it. BCH is the only other coin that has a chance of surviving behind BSV, in my opinion.
And when you say coin, you mean chain of Bitcoin, or do you mean just any crypto asset in general?
It will only be BSV and BCH. And it's only going to be BSV, and BCH will live on for as long as it can.
Okay, I imagine we have some other differing opinions here.
My opinion is that competition keeps us honest. Anytime that one party or one group of people maintain control for too long, they start to go nuts. Absolute power corrupts absolutely. And with cryptocurrencies, with technologies like this, there's also a lot more to it because different technologies make different trade-offs, and there isn't going to be one tool that solves all problems. That said, the network effect is a thing. Metcalfe's law is a thing. The value of a network is proportional to the square of its users. So for a long time, I was of the opinion that doing a hard fork to increase the block size without overwhelming consent or consensus was a bad idea because it would not get any adoption. And I'm kind of still of that opinion. I'm not sure that Bitcoin Cash is going to do what I think it can do, even though I think it is the best technology, just because it doesn't have that initial momentum. So there is always going to be an incentive to cloud or to clot near the most popular thing. So there will always be basically a power law distribution of sizes and of values and use frequencies for different cryptocurrencies. But things like Ethereum are always going to exist because Ethereum has way more programmability than any Bitcoin-based system does. Things like Zcash are always going to exist because Zcash has way more privacy than anything except for maybe in the future Ethereum, when they merge, is going to have. Maybe. I said maybe. I did say maybe.
Well, I think a few other things have much more privacy than Zcash, but...
You think that there's something better than ZK stocks? Okay, whatever.
Well, Zcash's implementation of ZK stocks, yeah.
Okay. In any case, Monero Dash, something like that is always going to have a niche. So yeah, I think we're going to always have multiple things, and I think that that's fine.
So I agree with him that experimentation is good, competition is good. Having said that, like he said, Keynesian beauty contests or Schelling points are a real thing, and it's hard to displace. Path dependence is a real thing. Lock-in and switching costs are a real thing. Bitcoin has it out of the gate first. Winner by a long mile. It'll continue to maintain its momentum. That doesn't mean experiments won't happen. Even if you have the best system demonstrably working and has wide adoption, people are always going to want to have newer experiments. They're going to have different ideas. They're going to think their implementation is somehow going to get around it. So that will continue to exist, and that's a good thing. I agree with him on that. I also agree that there are special niche use cases like privacy. I also think Zcash is probably best of the breed. ZK Snarks is probably the best of the breed in terms of privacy right now. I don't want to get into Monero Zcash debate because it's too much for one session. But having said that, in the real world, we don't settle our financial contracts in anything but the highest quality money. For example, if you wanted to pay me for being here, I wouldn't accept payment in Zimbabwe dollars. Same thing is going to happen to money, which Bitcoin is trying to become. All financial contracts will be, and instruments will be rewritten on layer 2 or layer 3 of Bitcoin. And there will be special purpose use cases like Zcash and other stuff.
Here's a question. Do you ever see Bitcoin Core, BTC, the most popular chain right now, ever kind of changing things around and saying, you know what, actually, we do want to have on-chain scaling, we do want to have larger blocks, because given it has, this huge network effect already, and, I don't want to speak definitively, but my understanding is also like Jonathan, where like the majority of Bitcoin users, when this kind of, before the hard fork, were in favor of having bigger blocks. Whether it's right or wrong, it's a different story, but just that there was a majority of people that wanted that, but it wasn't a majority of the developers implementing the code. So I personally can see a scenario in which BTC does implement larger block sizes at some point in the future. Is that something that, how do people feel about that?
I think it's unreasonable to completely rule anything out because the future is always uncertain, right? It could happen. I think that is actually more likely than most people think is going to happen, whether it be big blocks or whether it's changing this feature or that, or whatever it is, like Taproot. That's the other thing about Bitcoin. It is that it is not ossified yet, in the sense that all of the things that are shown to work on other chains that address some of the core problems that Bitcoin as it exists today have will be subsumed by the main chain or as layer 2 or layer 3 solutions. So we want that. Having said that, you got to maintain some fundamental basic principles that it started on. So,
how do you feel? Do you think what are the chances of you think BTC implementing large block sizes or taking an SV-like approach?
I'd love to see them do it. Yeah, go for it and then see what happens. It's not even just that. There's a lot of other protocol changes that need to be made. It's not just blocks. The whole protocol was changed.
Do you see that as a possibility?
I don't know, like some of the leaders in the space, or Peter Todd at least, is talking about inflating keeping an inflationary amount of BTC, meaning that it'll go more than the 21 million Bitcoins. I think I don't know if they're going to go that direction or if they're going to try to increase the blocks so they can get more transactions, but I don't know, it's a possibility, I guess, yeah.
Yeah, Peter Todd and Luke Jr. both want to decrease the block size to 300 kilobytes. So I'll just say this. I would love it if BTC increased the block size. The future that I'm most concerned about is not that BTC is going to win and I'm going to be poor, but that BTC is going to lose against the US dollar. And I think that with a fixed 1 megabyte block size plus 80% for SegWit, BTC is going to have a really hard time competing against the dollar. I don't think that the Lightning Network is going to provide a user experience that is as good as the US dollar does, and you have to be 10 times better in order to gain adoption. So yeah, I think that there's a small chance that Bitcoin Cash is going to replace BTC. I would be happy with that, but I'd also be happy with BTC, getting their act together. It would also be nice if this issue is resolved, because I think that bigger blocks is clearly necessary and better, and it'd be nice to move on to the next debate and to start refining on some other dimension so that we can just get something as good as possible, as soon as possible.
Cool. Well, I know there's a lot of people here in the audience that probably have their own questions and opinions. Before we transition to audience questions, I want to just do something, just a little experiment, which is audience can participate. I'd ask everyone in the panel to participate. I'm just going to name the 3 different assets, and if you hold them, raise your hand. So BTC, BCH, BSV. Cool. So let's start with some audience questions. Who wants to get us started here?
I have a question for the SV person. It seems like you were saying that SVs has the idea that they're not going to change.
Given it is different than BTC, and then whether or not they have, where is your, why do you feel like not changing the protocol ever is the way to develop Bitcoin?
So, quickly again, TCP/IP was changed. There's going to be major problems for banks and businesses. So that's why we can't change the protocol. Now, we're bringing it back to 2010. There's a quote from Satoshi saying that the entire protocol has been set. You don't need to change it. What needs to be fixed are certain things. Well, the way Bitcoin Cash is trying to fix this, or they're doing things like CTOR, canonical transaction reordering. So they're changing the protocol, the way you order transactions. Really, our mindset is to build better hardware so that you can mine these blocks faster. It's really about solving block propagation. These are not protocol changes. This is just the way that miners can communicate with each other, the way they send blocks but not changing the actual orders of the transaction. So
did it change the protocol from BTC?
Well, we're bringing it back to 2010. BTC changed the protocol of what Bitcoin actually is,
Block sizes are bigger in SVM.
Block size got introduced in 2010, 2011. They were never there from the very beginning.
Then it seems like you're saying that SV is both the original thing, but it seems like it's not the original thing.
So you're saying it hard forked back to before a previous fork, and therefore it undid a fork, and it's not actually a fork. It's like a fork of unforking a fork.
You're basically so. The SegWit was the only thing that if that had gone through, we wouldn't be able to unfork a fork. In your words. So that is good why we were able to get away from SegWit when it got there. So, but everything else before SegWit, is perfect. It's okay. I mean, they added things like RBF replaced by fee. So it's these types of changes to the protocol that screwed up what Bitcoin is.
So you would say changing the block size is not a change to the protocol, just to be clear?
Yes.
Okay. Looks like Jonathan wants to get in on this.
I want to do some follow-up questions. So obviously, so Amaury Sachet, the main or original developer of Bitcoin Cash, posted on Twitter a signed message saying that he was Satoshi Nakamoto, and it was totally a lie. He's not. He's totally a fraud. Amaury, added a few things to BCH that were against the true Satoshi's vision for Bitcoin Cash. For Bitcoin. For example, he added a new difficulty adjustment algorithm instead of the original 2-week one. He also changed the signature scheme used by transactions. So when is BSV going to remove these changes?
My understanding is that a lot of these were removed and back during the fork. I will say that I don't have that specific answer, and should we do this again, I will watch this video and make sure I have that answer for you.
Okay.
But I know the answer will be out there if we do the research.
Well, I think definitely after this conversation, we could watch it and stay in conversation over email. I know I definitely would like that. So let's give one more question.
What was the original question? Sorry.
It seemed to me that that SV did change it
Yeah.
seemed like it changed
Right.
the protocol.
So-
I was wondering, how can they be so sure that they'll never change it again?
In November, basically the reason, the claimed reason why the fork happened was because Bitcoin SV wanted to add opmul, op-L shift, op-R shift, and one other operation to the opcodes. These were opcodes that did originally exist in Bitcoin version 0.1, but had bugs, so they were disabled by Satoshi. The versions that are being or that were re-enabled by Bitcoin SV are not actually the same as the versions in the Bitcoin 0.1 code. Those were, I believe, arithmetic left shift and right shift, whereas new versions are logical left shift and right shift. There's also some differences on the operands. So that was one of the changes. The other change that SV did was they increased the block size to 128 megabytes, which I don't think Satoshi is inherently against, although I think he would have objected to the timing. The other side was Bitcoin Cash added canonical transaction ordering, which was designed to help with block propagation. And also it added another opcode called check data sig verify, which is like the regular signature verification code, but it can work on arbitrary data, and it allows some really cool new tricks like pay to identity. So,
Yeah, I mean, I think we both understand of why we forked away from BTC. Another major reason why BSV forked away from BCH is because of adding in CTOR, adding in DSV, checkpoints. So when you take a look, so both of us are going to be both on the same camp of bringing it back to the original Bitcoin, BCH and BSV. So that question.
The bigger blocks.
But the main difference, my main difference is that they're adding in things that allow anonymity, and that is a major problem because we need to have governments and businesses building on top of Bitcoin in order for it to become useful and become the real money for the world. So when you add in anonymity, the government is just going to create more regulation to stop that from happening. So we need to have something that isn't anonymous but is private. That is the main difference between BSV and BCH, and we are much, even though you can make these points, we're still the closest to the white paper than any other coin out there.
Okay, any other questions from the audience?
What's the argument against larger block sizes?
I'm really good at this one.
Why don't you take it and then I'll take it.
okay, so this argument that I'm going to say is something that I actually believe. But I'm going to present it in the way that Bitcoin Core Camp present, which is not quite the way that I present it. So there's this thing that happens with block propagation that is kind of counterintuitive. So as blocks get bigger, the time that it takes before all other miners hear about that block increases. And that causes what's known as orphan races. So an orphan race is where two people find a block at the same time and they have to fight over which block gets in. And that's well and good, it's, kind of just how the protocol works, except that there's an unfairness that happens specifically when orphan races happen. If you have 30% of the network hash rate, you're going to win 30% of those orphan races outright. So you're going to win a total of 65% of them. That means that whenever orphan races happen, they encourage miners to join the largest pool possible. And this means that we have to make sure that block propagation times stay as small as possible in order to prevent centralization from happening. Because once it starts to happen, the pools are going to get larger, which means that the revenue difference is going to get larger, which means that it's just going to be runaway centralization. Then we're going to have a 51% majority that will choose what transactions we can and cannot do. And then if I want to buy milk on a Wednesday, the government's going to say no because they're going to own all the hash rate. So that's kind of the slippery slope argument. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
There's one other thing. So that is mining centralization because of the variance and the network lag that allows the bigger pools to actually win more of those races. The second one is the full node. If you care about full nodes and distribution of full nodes, if you want to verify all your transactions and get that security guarantee, bigger blocks stand against that. And I guess that's the argument BSV is making. You don't really care. It doesn't matter. We're just going to give you utility, and the rest is up to the gods.
Can I talk for myself this time?
So my response to myself is that, yes, this effect is real, and it is something that we have to be careful of, but this effect doesn't happen at 1 megabyte. It happens, or it starts to become significant at block propagation times in the 5 to 20 second range. Currently with BTC, we're propagating 1 megabyte blocks or 1.2 megabyte blocks in 150 milliseconds, and each additional megabyte takes an additional 10 milliseconds. So with that technology, we can scale pretty far before we get to the point where mining centralization occurs. And just for reference, at 20-second delays, a 30% pool will have a 1% revenue advantage over a tiny pool. So that's what the math is.
Do you know specifically of what size the block needs to be for it to become a worry? Are we talking like hundreds of gigabytes, or I'm just doing some napkin math based on what you said?
Yeah, it really depends on the technology. So the 150 milliseconds plus 10 milliseconds per megabyte figure is using... No, that's not based on the hardware. That's largely a factor of which software is used. That number comes when you're using Matt Corallo and Greg Maxwell's block propagation protocol known as Fiber, using its trusted mode. Now, Fiber has both an untrusted mode and a trusted mode, and the trusted mode is way faster. So the question is, can we rely on that trusted mode for securing the blockchain against centralization in the face of rising pressure, rising block size pressure? What happens if somebody starts to attack it? Or if somebody who owns all of the servers that are providing this trusted mode gets abducted or something like that? So yeah, it really depends on what your security assumptions are. And there are a few different points at which tension happens. 20 megabytes for Bitcoin Cash using the common technology on Bitcoin Cash. That's about where you get to 20 seconds currently. I'm trying to fix that. With Fiber, you could get up to 100 megabytes, 150 megabytes. Bitcoin SV has actually got the same technology as Bitcoin Cash for block propagation, except that they have all their miners talking directly to each other. Well, all the major miners, which means that if you're not a major miner, you're not part of that cabal, and you can't get blocks quickly, which might be a problem. So yeah, it's long term though. We can get it to multiple gigabytes. We just have to put in the engineering.
So beyond the lag issues that he talked about, there are corner cases where people rely on broadcasting these transactions not over wire or fiber, but ham radio, stuff like that, under heavy pressure of censorship, like for example in China. Network security and censorship becomes a bigger problem, which is going to be increasingly a problem as block size goes up. So a small block is a protection against arbitrary censorship of relaying transaction states.
And for anyone interested, I met with the founder of a new blockchain that is trying to counter this latency effect called Space Mesh. I just recommend looking them up if you feel like you can't have like a fair store value or distributed payment system when you have this orphan problem. Any other? Dave?
I have a question for BTC regarding the future of payment for miners. So let's say it's like 2 halvings from now, and the block reward is around 3. And let's say Lightning Network's doing great, and most transactions are off-chain. What revenue is there to pay miners, and will it have an adverse effect on the hash rate?
So just the question is, when there's a halvening, if there's a lot of transactions off-chain, what's the incentive for miners to secure the network?
That is a complicated question and a very contentious one. There are several assumptions that go into it. What is the clearing price of Bitcoin in the liquid currency, which is USD, at that time when the halvening happens, right? So there's a lot of FUD about halvening and how that affects hash rate. I would refer you to the 2018 paper by Pagnotta and Barashi, where they actually analyze the equilibrium price. And it is not entirely predictable what halvening or block reward halvening does necessarily to hash rate or to price. It depends on where it is relative to the actual equilibrium at that point. Layer 2 is eventually going to have to be, everything that you do on layer 2 will be settled on layer 1. You can have infinite payment channels. That just means there's a lot more transactions that are happening. Eventually they have to be settled on main chain. You can't just keep a payment channel open for infinite time. That's what we know today. There will be a lot more financial instruments built on layer 2 and layer 3, which ultimately will also need to be settled in. So I think if you go back to what Satoshi said, or I'm probably butchering the quote, people will either have a shit ton of transactions or none, and whatever happens to Bitcoin is richly deserved in both instances. So the argument people have made, like Peter Todd I think has talked about, hey, we should introduce fixed inflation for infinity. So that actually goes back to the economic argument. Who has to pay for network security? Is it the people who are hodling it, right, that should pay for network security by inflation? Inflation is stealing your purchasing power slowly over time. Or should the people actually using the chain for transactions, who should pay for with the fee market, who should pay for it? I'm not going to take a strong position on that. I think the market will determine it. That will be an experiment that we will see. There will probably be both, and one will win out. And it's anybody's guess as to who.
Is the first part of your answer, though, about how, of course, it'll depend on the market price of Bitcoin at that time, and
right.
It could be a higher real value, even if nominally it's less.
Right. If it, for example, after two halvenings, if the USD price of Bitcoin is $500,000, it won't be a problem.
Sure.
If it is $1,000, it will be a problem. So it depends on where the price is relative to the actual equilibrium based on the network status at that time, and a whole bunch of other variables.
But it is dependent on it.
It's always dependent. I mean, that's the premise it started with. If Bitcoin stayed at $1, you wouldn't have the hash rate to protect the network that you do today. That is always there. Until it becomes widely adopted and until the volatility goes away because it has become the dominant medium of exchange and somehow becomes stable, that will continue to be there, not just for Bitcoin, but for any chain.
Sure.
What happens to Ethereum if price crashes by 99% tomorrow? Same thing. The inflation policy is not a protection against that.
I think we have time for one more question.
In terms of a method of commerce, I'm under the impression that if you buy a cup of coffee with Bitcoin, it's a capital gain, and you have to report it as taxes. Is that a hurdle anywhere near being solved?
So I'll answer this one, and the short answer is no. If you hold Bitcoin, any of the different types of Bitcoin, really any asset that isn't like the US dollar, and you're living in the United States, and then you use that asset to pay for something, you have capital gains. And solving that isn't so much like a technological innovation issue, it's a regulatory issue. And I personally am not optimistic about that being solved in a meaningful way, unless, let's say Bitcoin or some other crypto asset were to gain such widespread adoption worldwide. And this was changed in other countries before the US, and the US took an agnostic position and then followed suit. But if we look at how the US sets policy, they usually don't take an agnostic position when things rise around the world. They usually are kind of a leader to take positions on this. So, yeah.
Can I add to that?
So it depends on the jurisdiction. If you move to Puerto Rico, you don't pay income tax. That means you don't pay capital gains tax. I think also Japan might be doing this where crypto is exempt from capital gains tax. So yeah, I mean, vote.
On a corollary, since U.S. citizens are taxed on a worldwide income. It's pretty much, no matter where you are, sans maybe Puerto Rico.
Well, you
Except
could,
Puerto Rico.
Yeah.
Apparently.
or you could move to Japan and renounce your U.S. citizenship.
Yeah. Like that.
Carrie.
So you talked about a Keynesian beauty contest around users. So like, what are users kind of going to choose, and will that kind of belief in a certain currency, like, you know, mean that one of these wins out? But how much is this also a beauty contest among the developers? And where do the incentives between, or the beliefs between the users and the developers differ? And like, to what extent are the developers kind of in control versus the ultimate users of any one of these implementations?
So to what extent are the developers in control versus the users, and how much of a differing Keynesian beauty contest is there going on between users and developers? Anyway.
Remember, there's two types of developers. There's the developers that are trying to change the protocol, and then there's the developers that are building on top of Bitcoin. So when you look at Bitstagram, which is the Instagram on BSV, I mean, we basically have Instagram on BSV already. So these are the businesses that need to be built on Bitcoin. We don't need to be changing the protocol anymore. So in terms of the developers, we need to distinguish the people that are trying to change the protocol and the developers that are building businesses on top of Bitcoin. So I don't know if that answered anything.
You can go first. So which beauty contest is more important is actually an interesting question. You could say it's Keynesian beauty contest all the way down, right? But markets have a way of fixing this. People are not struck with the winning, whatever the developers think is going to win, and if they migrate there, that doesn't necessarily mean that people are going to do that. Eventually, market price will determine how many people get to work on one asset, one chain, or the other. So I think if you believe in markets, markets will determine it. Developers are just part of the market. They're not isolated and an island away from it.
Yeah, so the question of developers playing the Keynesian beauty contest game, it definitely happens. Most of the developers in cryptocurrency are open source developers, either volunteers or paid for by donations or by their own early investments. And because they have that much freedom, it allows them to do some really cool things and to take a lot of risks. But it also means that a lot of their motivation comes from the desire to be loved. They want to impress other people in their peer group. And so they think, hey, what feature is valued in this community? How can I add to the community's own self-image and valuation of itself? And yeah, that tends to be a divergent process. It tends to result in ideas that just keep getting more and more divorced from what matters, from the user experience, from what will help people. And so the answer to that question is, Karen, let me introduce you to my friend Thomas Hegel. So this guy says that there's always a process of point and counterpoint, of a thesis and an antithesis. People always will organize into these groups where they come up with some idea, they stick to it, they take it as far as they can, and eventually they get too far from the truth, and somebody else comes up with another idea and takes that farther, and then maybe after a while there's a synthesis, and that's just that's what we see in cryptocurrency. People fork because they have a legitimate or illegitimate disagreement, and sometimes the ideas are adopted, and so that's all we can really hope for.
So I want to give a big thank you to all of our panelists here today. Chandra, Jonathan, Sonu, thanks for coming here, and thanks to our host, Node. We'll be around for a little bit here, and we will be posting this video online like all the other Node New Economy series events. I hope to see you at the next one, and thanks so much for coming.